Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on modern poetry from your CC1 of your CBCS first semester course. Now, today I'll be talking about primarily three poets who fall under the scope of CC1. First is T.S. Eliot, then we come to W.B. Yeats and Dylan Thomas. However, I'm not sure if we'll be going in that order only. But more or less, these are the three poets that we would be talking about. So let me quickly share my screen and let's begin. And we are sharing. Okay, so let's begin. So, modern poetry. Now, I have taught you all the features of modernist literature, all the influences, and so on and so forth. So, I would not be going into them once again. However, today I am directly going into the poets. Now, if I follow the chronology of the dates of the poets, then W.B. Yeats should be the first one whom we discuss. So, our number one poet is William Butler Yeats. Sorry. Uh, Yeats's dates are 1865 to 1939. So you can see she's seen quite a large share of Victorian era as well and the modern era as well. Now he was born in an enlightened Irish family of Dublin and he was educated in London. So born in Dublin, educated in London, and he was after 1890 he became a member of the Irish Revolution, of the Irish nationalist movement. And he founded the Irish National Theatre. The Irish National Theatre, and also became a senator of the Irish Free States during 1922 and 28, and obtained the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923. And he died in the south of France in 1939. Okay. Now, to begin with, Yeats was influenced by the late 19th century aesthetic movement. So, if we talk about his influences, then on the one hand, we have the aesthetic movement of the late 19th century, like Walter Pater, like Benedetto Croce, etc. Also, he was influenced by the poetry of Spenser and Shelley. Okay, and he sought his themes. For his themes, he went to the Irish legends. Okay, so for his themes, he went to the Irish legends. And we see that several legends occur in his poem, several legendary uh, characters occur in his poem, and therefore there is an elfin or a fairy like quality in his poetry. Often, not always. Now, the first important poem that we need to learn from Yeats's poetry is, so the first poem that we need to concern ourselves, the first collection that we need to concern ourselves is called The Wanderings of Oisin. Oisin was a legendary Irish figure and it came out in 1889. The next collection is Poems, which came out in 1895. The third important collection is The Wind Among the Reeds. This one came out in 1898. The fourth collection was The Shadowy Waters. I'm sorry, due to the winter, my hand has stopped working. It's freezing, and therefore I'm finding it difficult to write. So, The Shadowy Waters. This one came out in 1900. Okay. After this came out The Lake Isle of Innisfree, although it was an earlier poem. The Lake Isles of Innisfree. I'm extremely sorry, it will take my hand some time to adjust in this cold. This one came out in 1893. Number 6 is The Green Helmet and Other Poems. This one came out in 1910. Okay, now finally, the very important volume, Responsibilities. It came out in 1914. Now, if you look at all these are more uh, these poems. These poems are very subjective and they contain the vestiges of romanticism. Okay. Now, his later poetry, although there was a realism which marks him as a modernist, but there was primarily a great deal of romanticism in them. His later poetry became increasingly philosophical in nature, like Wild Swans at Cooley. This one came out later, and it is more philosophical in nature. Wild Swans at Kule. This one is more philosophical in nature and it came out in 1919. The Tower. It came out in 1928. And The Winding Stair. I'm sorry, there's a fair going on around my house, and therefore you might hear some noises of music, etc., coming over there. Now, what happens is that from this romantic realist, uh, he appears as a realist symbolist. I have already spoken about the symbolist movement in France, and therefore I'm not repeating myself. So Yeats starts appearing as a realist symbolist in these poems, and he has a very metaphysical tone over here. And he was always a great user of the rhythm. So here he uses the poetic rhythm, and rituals, his poems become very ritualistic. He uses rituals very much, and the beauty of his poems come from the colloquial nature of them. So the colloquial nature is very important for his subsequent poetry. All right. Now, if we try to focus on the themes that Yeats employs, then we will see that he was a man who was not very prone to science, but he was rather a mystique. And mysticism, therefore, is a major part of his writings. And what happened is that, like supernatural, fairies, magic, superstition, the occult, these feature regularly in his poetry. And various mystical influences like Neoplatonism, like Kabbalism, I mean the Kabbalah, and such influences worked on him very deeply. And therefore, William Blake, who was a master of such patterns, was a severe influence on him. And what happens is that in his work, which is called The Rose of the World, in this text, Yeats blends classical and Celtic mythology. So, both classical mythology and Celtic mythology. Celtic means Irish mythology, old Irish mythology. And these mythologies are mixed from the perspective of Neoplatonism. And he detected a dichotomy in man and saw that poetry was a bridge between the spiritual and the real world. Like in The Tower, which I have talked about, in the poem called The Tower. In this poem, in say, for example, Sailing to Byzantium, in these poems, we can easily see that there is a clear cut dichotomy between a tension almost between the spiritual and the sensual world. And Yeats's poetry also employs symbolism. It is very symbolic in nature, as I began with it. And he was um, very influenced by the French poets like uh, Verlaine, like Mallarmé, like Villiers, and also by Maeterlinck and others. And some of his favorite symbols are those of the tower standing for intellectual haven, or Byzantium, which represents a timeless ethos of art where one can easily escape from age and decay. And the symbolism often tends to make his poetry obscure. It's true, but then he uses symbolism in a very beautiful way. And old age became a very important issue. Like in his last poems, if you focus on the circus animals' desertion, poems like An Acre of Grass, like When You Are Old, etc., he treats old age in a very interesting way. Like in a poem like When You Are Old, he begins, When you are old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad graces and loved your beauty with love false or true. But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. Now, therefore, you can see that his style was very interesting. And therefore, we come to his style next. And when we look at his style, we see that his early verse displays a languor, which was characteristic of um, romantic poetry, and even in early Victorian poetry of Tennyson as well. And there is a sonority, also a simplicity. I'm sure you have read about the Pre-Raphaelites in your Victorian age, and Yeats's poetry is reminiscent of the Pre-Raphaelites. Uh, and he was a very skilled artist with a very direct approach. Uh, and there was a lightness in his touch and a splendid expression could be seen in his poetry. Like if you look at the poems like The Second Coming and poems like No Second Troy, then you will see that his poetry was sometimes prophetic in nature as well. And you must remember that Yeats was associated with several occult societies, and he was also under the influence of a certain Indian sage whose name was Purohit Swami. And this Purohit Swami helped him to translate the Upanishads. And Yeats has translated the Upanishads, and he was the one who helped in the propagation of the Song Offerings by Rabindranath Tagore. Now, Yeats wrote many plays as well, but I am not going into them because we do not have Yeats as the playwright. We only have Yeats as the poet. Now, David Dacius, who was a very important historian of literature, he says uh, about Yeats, His voice is always his own. It is haunting and magical and fascinating and sometimes terrible. And all of this makes Yeats one of the greatest English poets. And we cannot but agree that Yeats was truly one of the greatest of the English poets of that time, at least, if not one of the greatest uh, of all times. Now, from Yeats, we come to our second poet in question, who is T.S. Eliot. Thomas Stearns Eliot. Eliot's dates are 1888 to 1965. He was born in St. Louis, uh, in Missouri, and this was in America, United States of America. And although his family originally came from East Coker in England, okay, and he always wanted to return to East Coker. He studied in Harvard, then Sorbonne and Oxford, and he worked as a banker in the Lloyd's Bank. So I often jokingly say that who is the world's uh, richest, who is the world's, which poet is the world's greatest banker? It's Eliot. Which novelist is the world's greatest insurance agent? Franz Kafka, so on and so forth. And here he worked for about 8 years, 8 or 9 years. And from 1917 to 19, he was an assistant editor of a famous magazine of that time called The Egoist. After this, he started as the editor of the Criterion, which became a major journal of that time. From 1923 onwards, he also was the director of the Faber and Faber company. Until date, the company exists and is booming every year. From 1932 to 1933, he was the Norton Professor of Poetry at Harvard. So, the Norton Professor of Poetry at Harvard. Okay. In 1948, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. He wrote his PhD thesis, and he also won the Order of Merit in the same year. He wrote his thesis on F.H. Bradley, who was a major philosopher of England at that time. He was a philosophy student. So he wrote his work on F.H. Bradley. Now, the first collection that came out of Proofrock of Eliot is called Proofrock and Other Observations. This came out in 1917. And among all the poems, the first to shock the people was the love song of J. Alfred Proofrock. because Eliot realized that poetry was divorced from the blood vessels of the era, and he wanted to reconnect poetry to the roots of what people think, what people feel, how people deal with issues. And therefore, for Eliot, it became a major uh, issue to reconnect poetry to the blood vessels of the times. And Eliot did a brilliant job in reconnecting the blood vessels of poetry to uh, the times itself. Now, Proofrock revolutionized the 20th century poetry in English. And look, Proofrock, quite like Shakespeare's touchstone, became the sole arbiter of the quality of poetry at that time in the genteel society. Because if you look at the word, you can write it like this: proof plus rock, so touchstone. Touchstone is a stone which basically tests the quality of gold, the purity of gold. Now, with the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, what happened was that poetry ceased to be uh, the gleaning of beautiful images from the world of nature, which was filtered through the poet's sensibility and presented in sonorous cadences. What Prufrock does is, through satire and irony, often at the expense of himself, he presents the seedy side of contemporary life. And what happened was that this was a major shift from the Victorian and Georgian poetry, because Eliot rejected the so called poetic imagery and the presentation of symbolic images. And basically, he starts a conversation where memory plays a major role, and the presence of a persona, that is, the persona of Proofrock, uh, the mask of Proofrock became very important, and it dawned a completely new era in English poetry. And Eliot had a lot of influences. On the one hand, from the classics, he had been influenced by Dante. From the Renaissance, he was influenced by John Donne. I mean, from the post Renaissance age, by John Donne, by Turner. He was also influenced by the French symbolists like Laforgue, Jules Laforgue, Tristan Zara, uh, a bit. Zara was not a symbolist, he was a Dadaist. He was a bit influenced by Zara, but primarily by Laforgue, by Baudelaire, Charles. This is not Charles, okay? This is Charles Baudelaire. Also by um, Corbière, by Mallarmé, by Julien Benda, Remy de Gourmont, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, if I start talking about Eliot, I can go on for days and days, but I would not. Now, apart from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, there were other poems which are very important over here, like the Portrait of a Lady, like Rhapsody on a Windy Night, like Preludes, like La Figlia chez Piaget, etc. Okay. Now, what happens is that these go on to create a dialectic of symbolism, of intellectual irony, of imagism, and this creates basically a new discourse of poetry which was uh, absolutely brand new. You know, T.E. Hume said that the project of modernism was to bring home the absolutely new, and Eliot did that. Even in his second collection, known as Poems, published in 1920, images from the past are very beautifully juxtaposed with those from the present to bring out the hollowness, the emptiness, the atrophy of modern civilization. And one poem from here which deserves our special mention, which is Gerontion or Gerontion, whatever you call it, first published in 1919. Now, this is a very long poem about an old blind man uh, who considers his past and the future and realizes with certain agony that he has nothing called life behind him. And what happens is that thinking for the first time becomes a very important issue over here. And thinking is itself almost like a physical action, like a physical sensation over here. And therefore, you will see that when you will grow up, you will study Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. And you will see that there is a character called Lucky who thinks out aloud, and that is an action, that is a physical sensation. And you will see that in many ways, the old man of Gerontion is a precursor to Lucky. The third collection is very important, called The Wasteland. If you do your masters, then maybe we'll study it together. Mm. The Wasteland is perhaps the greatest of all poems that ever was written by Eliot, and this is the 100th year of The Wasteland in 2022. And this is basically, uh, on the one hand, it is a bewildering medley of intractable states of mind and being, of hallucinations and events, of people and expressions merging into one another and cutting across time and space. On the other hand, this is the greatest, perhaps, poetry ever written in the history of the human animal. It is broadly based on the myth of the Holy Grail. Okay, the myth of the Holy Grail, and it is loosely based on the myth of the Holy Grail, but not the direct myth, as the myth was interpreted by Jesse L. Weston and Sir James Fraser. Fraser interpreted it in The Golden Bough, and Weston did it in From Ritual to Romance. Okay, and Eliot incorporated both. He incorporated both of them to write his The Wasteland. The text is divided in five sections. Section A is the called The Burial of the Dead. Section 2 is called the game of chess. Section 3 is called the fire sermon. Section 4 is called uh, death by water. And section 5 is called what the thunder said. Now you'll be surprised that Eliot deals with the Grail legend in these 5 sections, but each of these sections are associated with one of the 5 elements. Like the burial of the dead is with earth, the fire sermon is with fire, this is with water, what the thunder said, earth, fire, water. Uh, this is with air, and the fifth is the spirit or the essence. And the wasteland is basically a history of civilization in general and of man's eternal quest for salvation. So, salvation becomes a major issue over here. And the wasteland is probably London with all this sordidness, its isolation and social vacuum, but it can be anywhere. And what happens is that Eliot brings in a character from the Greek mythology whose name is Tiresias. Tiresias is a seer. You already know who Tiresias is. He is basically uh, a seer, an oracle, and he brings in the overall unity. Uh, though the real unity of the poem has been questioned time and time again, and even till date, I do not know whether there is any unity in the poem. Uh, what have I mean? All that I can say is that this text is truly polyvocal, multilinear, and polyglot. It uses multiple voices, multiple languages, multiple layers, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to just single it out. And often these things have led on to its unintelligibility and its incomprehensibility. Many people have questioned this. And Eliot was famous for his poetic techniques of allusion, that is, referring to other poets, other works of literature, his epigraphs, where he deliberately, without quotation, brings in textual portions from other texts, where the other text, say for instance, I bring 2 lines from some other text and then I write my text. So these 2 lines become, or this text becomes a commentary on this text, on my text, and my text becomes a commentary on this text. And thus he maintains the concept of his tradition. Imagine there's a bottle and there's a little bit of water in this bottle. Okay. Now, in this water, imagine if you are dropping a colored drop. So, this is water, there is no color, and you are dropping a red drop. So, what happens is that this red drop dissolves in the water and makes it a bit red. Then, if you drop a blue drop, same thing, green drop, same thing. So, what happens is that if this water is the tradition of European poetry or writing since the times of Homer, then what happens is that this new drop is a new literature, new artwork, which is changing the entire permutation and combination of this tradition itself. Okay, and therefore this is so very important. Now, apart from the wasteland, oh, one more thing. In this section, the poem ends with a reference to the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, where Brahman, in chapter 5 of the Upanishad, Brahman asks the Devas, the Asuras, and the humans, what have they understood of his word da? The Devas say datta, to give. The Asuras said um, Dadvam, and the humans say Damayata. So Datta is to give, Dadvam is to have a bit of conscience, and Damayata is to be of observance. So what happens is that uh, this is very interesting. After this, uh, come his aerial poems are important, but not so much. Then comes the Hollow Men in 1929. By this time, Eliot has become a Christian. He has become a Catholic, and his viewpoints are changing. In 1927, he got baptized, and his viewpoints were changing. But in this, the Hollow Men, he deals with the elegiac, sardonic atrophy of the modern man. He deals with the hollowness of modern man. We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, headpiece filled with straw. And our worlds do not end with a bang but with a whimper. So we had expected a big bang, but we get a bangachi, nothing more. And after the Hollow Man, we see that his poetry became much, much religious in Ash Wednesday, when the overtone kept on changing. And in his last poems, which is four quartets, Eliot was obsessed with time. His quest for religious truth acquires a new intensity, and the tone of the earlier Eliot has become now much, much mellow, and the allusions become more infrequent. And it was the best uh, religious poetry of that time, which used material from Saint John of Cross. Saint John of the Cross. This was the primary source, and there were other sources as well, but I am not going into them. And what happens is that here you will see that each poem has an anchor in a local scene, which gives a concreteness to the imagery and point of reference from which symbolic suggestions can move out and to which they can return. What do I mean by the local scenes? This poem is also divided in parts. The four quartets actually appeared separately, although together it appeared for the first time in 1944, but it appeared separately as Burnt Norton in 1936, East Coker in 1940, the Dry Salvages in 1941, and finally came out Little Gidding in 1942. So this was more or less uh, Eliot. Now, if we look at the features of his poetry, we'll see that uh, he brought English poetry into a new era, and he altered altogether the connotation of the word poetic. Now, the poet was no longer a sweet singer whose function was to pander to the languid dreams of a pampered sensibility, or even to display the poet's emotional problems in artfully cadenced words. Now, what happened was that the modern age was seeing repeated advancements in the areas of science, in the areas of technology, in the areas of thought, in the areas of philosophy. And what happened was that life was not the same anymore. And therefore, what happened was that these poets had to look after the new uh, issues of that time. And Eliot did that. Now, what happens is that Stephen Spender says something very beautiful. He says that uh, Eliot, uh, in his poetry, brings into confrontation the spiritually negative character of his contemporary world and the spiritually positive character of the past tradition. Actually, in his poetry, what happens is that the past and present they coexist, not very harmoniously, through contrary symbols, perhaps, which connote the values of spiritual life or death. And therefore, what happens is that um, salvation and damnation, these become the two parts of the same coin for Eliot. And Eliot's poetry is always in the lookout for salvation. And this is an important feature of Eliot's poetry, therefore. And it is very important to understand this concept of salvation when we are dealing with Eliot's poetry. Now, this leads us to our third and final author of this lecture, who is Dylan Thomas. Now, I would not go into very much detail of Dylan Thomas uh, because you see, when we pitch him against poets like Yeats or Eliot, he I have no issue in saying that he definitely falls short in comparison when we pitch him against the grand masters of poetry of that time, like Yeats and Eliot. However, since our syllabus wants us to talk about him, then we'll be talking about him. So the third poet is Dylan Thomas. His original name is Dylan Marley Thomas. 1914 to 1953. These are his dates. Now, Dylan Thomas was a Welsh poet, and his poems were very famous during his lifetime, but after his death, his poetry stopped being taken so seriously. And what happened was that uh, he started writing poetry as a child, publishing his work in school magazines. And by 1930, he had taken to writing poems in penny notebooks. Penny notebooks are like those small pamphlets which are sold there in trains, in little magazine shops, and etc. And a number of his poetry was published in the Poets' Corner, which was such a penny notebook, and also, sorry, the Poets' Corner of the newspaper called the Sunday Referee, and also in the influential volume of New Verse. Now, the notebooks in which Thomas composed between 1930 and 34, when he was 16 to 20 years old, they reveal his struggle as a young man with a number of personal crises. And in um, 1965, Jacob Korg described these crises as uh, related to love affairs, to industrial civilization, and to the youthful problems of finding one's identity. Now, 18 poems were published in 1934, December 1934, after a short time, sorry, a short time after Thomas moved to London. And the volume did not at first receive any importance. But by the following spring, some influential newspapers and journals had reviewed it favorably. Now, what happened is that Thomas always received a lot of criticism, and because of his constant use of images and epithets, which are secretary or glandular. Now, what happened was that Thomas was obsessed with words, with their sound, with rhythm, and especially with the possibilities for multiple meanings. And this was very important as a style of Dylan Thomas. Now, um, what happened is that Dylan Thomas uh, published the second collection called 25 Poems in 1936. And during this time, uh, Thomas moved between London and Wales for a long time. In London, he began to meet influential people in the literary world like Herbert Read, Geoffrey Grigson, Norman Cameron, and Vernon Watkins, among others. And he became particularly close to Watkins. And what happened was that this second volume of poetry, which was published in September of 1936, uh, what happened was that most of the poems were revised from the notebooks, and only six entirely new poems were written, and the reviews were more or less favorable. Though most of the works in 25 poems were mined from older material, the volume includes a significant sonnet sequence of 10 poems, which are called Altarwise by Owl Light. Now, this was written in Ireland before publication, and in these sonnets, Thomas moved from the pre Christian primitivism of most of the 18 poems to a Christian mythology based upon love. And although these were seen as a failure as a whole, these were successful in certain parts and very important. These are from the perspective of religious sonnets. Um, on July 11 of 1937, Thomas married Caitlin McNamara, and during that time they were penniless. And Thomas's third book, The Map of Love, came out in August of 1939, the year war broke out in Europe, and it comprised a strange unison of 16 poems and 7 stories. And these stories were published in uh, several periodicals earlier. The volume was a commercial failure, perhaps because of the war, and although it found a very hearty review, the short stories uh, did not become that important. And the next year, he brought out a short story collection called The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog. But that is not very important. In 1940, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog came out, and he deliberately echoed James Joyce's A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man to retain that. And the reviews, I'm writing about the book, though it's not a poetry book. Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog. Joyce had a similar book called A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and this was published in 1940. This was published much, much earlier. And he deliberately wanted to keep this title to make it a bit of a potboiler. But the reviews were mixed and it didn't sit well with uh, many of the reviewers, and many of them found that this was a bit peachy and a bit schoolboyishly flippant. Now, what happened is that in 1940, Thomas began writing Adventures in the Skin Trade, a novel that he never completed. So the name of the novel was Skin Trade. Though Thomas began it, he never uh, completed this. Uh, in 1946, he brought out another collection of poetry called Deaths and Entrances. And here, many of his famous poems, like A Refusal to Mourn the Death by Fire of a Child in London. I know the title is huge. Uh, Again, Poem in October, The Hunchback in the Park, And Fernhill. Fernhill was earlier there in the syllabus. So these are very important. And 3,000 copies were sold in the first month after its publishing. And what happened was that this was an instant success. It was published by J.M. Dent, and Dent created. He ordered another 1,000, and this one is basically very important because Deaths and Entrances was the turning point in his life. And Thomas's last separate uh, volume of poetry before the collected poems was called Country Sleep. Country Sleep. Uh, it was published by New Directions in the United States in 1952, and after that came the collected poems in 19 uh, collected poems. Sorry, the entire title is Collected Poems, 1934 to 1952. So this was his uh, very important final collection. And although he had a very many BBC radio broadcasts, those were brought out in 1992. Uh, Fernhill, A Winter's Tale, Alterwise Owl Light, and Death Shall Have No Dominion, Poem in October, um, Lament, In My Craft of Sullen Art, In Country Sleep. These are some of his very important poems. Now, I am not going further into Thomas's life and biography because, to be very frank, he was never as important a poet as, say, Eliot or Yeats was. So, with this, we end this lecture and hope to see you in the next lecture. If there are any questions, please keep them in the comment section. Thank you so much. Have a good day.